year is 1064. Picture the burning deserts around Jerusalem, blinding sun, endless sand, and silence broken only by the whisper of hot winds. And into this unforgiving land marches a force so small it seems absurd. Just 800 hardened men from the north. Viking warriors who had already tested themselves in 1,000 battles. They were about to face an army that outnumbered them 40 to 1. What happened next would bend logic, defy every expectation, and carve itself into legend. It would also prove a chilling truth. Sometimes faith itself can be the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. But before I reveal how this massacre unfolded, let me ask you something. If this story already has you leaning in, if it already feels like the kind of tale you never thought possible, hit that like button right now. Because what comes next, it's going to shatter every idea you have about what religious fanaticism can unleash in war. Now here's the twist, our story doesn't begin under the desert sun. No, it starts far away on the cold, misty shores of Norway. There ruled a man who would forever be remembered for his audacity. King Magnus III, better known as Magnus Barefoot. The nickname came from his habit of wearing traditional Scottish garments, not the stiff royal attire of his peers. By the time he ruled, Christianity had already taken root in Scandinavia. But don't mistake that for a loss of Viking spirit. Far from it. Instead, something more dangerous emerged, a fusion of Christian zeal with Viking ferocity. A combination that created a new breed holy warriors. Magnus heard the calls of Pope Alexander VII, who urged the faithful across Europe to defend the sacred places of Christianity. Other nobles saw these crusading ventures as political opportunities, lands to conquer, titles to win. Magnus saw something else. He saw destiny, a chance to transform Viking ferocity into divine purpose. His men would not march to the Holy Land as simple conquerors. They would go as instruments of God's will, carrying axes in one hand and scripture in the other. The recruitment was unlike anything seen in Scandinavia before. Magnus didn't want farmers turned soldiers. He didn't want fresh recruits. He wanted killers, veterans hardened by years of fighting endless wars between rival Nordic kingdoms. Men who had proven themselves not once, but dozens of times. Only the best of the best, and the requirements brutal. Each of the 800 chosen warriors had to demonstrate three things: mastery of axe and sword and human endurance, and most importantly, an unshakable faith in their mission. No doubters, no cowards, no half-believers. Only those who saw themselves as weapons of God. For months, they trained relentlessly. This wasn't just traditional Viking combat. Magnus and his commanders blended ancient northern ferocity with Byzantine techniques learned from mercenaries. They drilled in defensive formations, practiced coordinated strikes, and above all, learned discipline, something Vikings historically lacked. These weren't wild raiders anymore. They were becoming a machine, each man a cog in a deadly hole. But physical strength wasn't enough. Magnus knew he needed to forge their souls as well. So he brought in monks, warrior priests, even military chaplains. Every day began and ended with prayer. Every meal was blessed, every weapon consecrated. Slowly, these men stopped seeing themselves as individuals. They became vessels of faith, berserkers with divine purpose. Religious fanatics who carried the destructive fury of their ancestors, but with spiritual justification to unleash it without restraint. By spring of 1064, the fleet was ready. From the harbor of Bergen, Viking ships carved their way through icy waters, heading south. But Magnus wasn't rushing straight to Jerusalem. His plan was cunning, build strength along the way. First stop the Orkney Islands, where he recruited mercenaries accustomed to fighting in warmer climates. From there down the coasts of Spain, clashing in skirmishes against Muslim forces. Each battle was a classroom. The Vikings discovered something critical. Their enemies here fought nothing like the Saxons or Danes of the north. These were mounted archers, expert horsemen, masters of desert tactics. But the Saracens quickly discovered something. Two, their opponents weren't just warriors, they were zealots. Men whose blend of Viking rage and religious devotion made them fight as though death itself was a gift. By winter, the fleet reached Constantinople. Here, Magnus struck alliances with the Byzantines, secured upgraded armor, and most ominously acquired new weapons like the dreaded incendiary substances similar to Greek fire. With spring, the sails turned east, bound for Jerusalem. Word of this strange northern force spread quickly. Muslim commanders laughed. What were 800 men against the vast armies guarding the Holy Land? It was almost insulting. One commander in particular, Elamir Abu Nasser, known as Shams al-Muluke, saw the arrival of these Norsemen as the perfect chance to prove his strength. He gathered a host so massive it dwarfed anything the Vikings had ever seen, 40,000 men. Heavy cavalry, mounted archers, specialized infantry, even siege engines. For him, this wasn't war, it was extermination. And so on the arid plains southeast of Jerusalem, near the fortress of Herodium, the two sides finally faced one another. The sight was staggering. On one side, endless lines of Muslim troops banners snapping in the desert wind, the ground trembling under the march of tens of thousands. On the other, a tight square of 800 Vikings, shields flashing beneath the pitiless sun axes, ready, silent, immovable. Abu Nasr's plan was straightforward, same he had used countless times. His cavalry would surround the enemy. Archers would rain death from above. Then infantry would strike and sweep the field. Foolproof, against every army he had faced before it had worked. Why would today be any different? What he didn't know was that Magnus had studied these tactics for months. His men had trained for this exact scenario. And more importantly, they weren't planning to survive. They were planning to die, but in a way that would take as many enemies as possible with them. To them, martyrdom wasn't defeat. It was the ultimate victory. At dawn, war horns split the desert air. Thousands of horsemen thundered forward, swords flashing like silver in the sun. But then the Vikings did something no one expected. They split apart. Now think about that for a second. 800 men against 40,000, and instead of staying together, they divided. Madness number strategy. The secret wasn't brute strength, it was psychology, terror. The Vikings knew fear could shatter armies larger than theirs. They divided into 8 circles of 100 men each, a formation they called the Wheel of Death. Each circle formed a miniature fortress, and between them stretched narrow killing zones. When cavalry charged, expecting to smash through a solid line, they instead rode into nightmares. Riders galloped between the circles, only to find themselves trapped as Vikings closed ranks behind them. Suddenly, the cavalry was cut off, split into fragments, hacked apart from all sides. What the Saracen horsemen witnessed defied belief. The Vikings fought with coordination so precise it looked supernatural. Every strike reinforced another. Every shield opened the way for a counterblow. They moved as though one mind guided them all. And worse, they fought without fear. Wounded men didn't falter, they fought harder. Dying men used their last breath to drag riders from saddles. They had entered the berserker trance, but this time it wasn't fueled by mead or rage. It was supercharged by faith. To them, every enemy slain was a step into paradise. Abu Nasr, watching from above, remained confident. 1,000 men lost nothing. His army was vast. He signaled the next move mounted archers. Keep distance. Rain arrows bleed the Norse dry. But once again, the Vikings had prepared. Through the night, they had built makeshift barricades from the shields of fallen foes and scraps of wood. When arrows fell like rain, they crouched beneath patient as predators. And when the storm ended, they struck back. What came next would be remembered as a glimpse of hell. The Vikings unleashed weapons their enemies had never seen: axes forged to cleave through armor, spears with hooked tips to drag horsemen from saddles, and most terrifying of all, fire. The flammable substance acquired in Constantinople burst across the sand, igniting riders in flames that water could not quench. Panic rippled through the Muslim lines. Archers who had crushed armies before found themselves against enemies who would not die quietly. Instead, they grew more terrifying with each casualty. And this was only the beginning. By midday, the desert sun scorched the battlefield like a furnace. Sweat stung the eyes of men, horses foamed at the mouth, and the air shimmered with heat. Abu Nasr had thrown his cavalry and his archers at the Norsemen. And yet, unbelievably, the northern warriors still stood. Not only that they had turned the battlefield into a nightmare, circles of fire smoldered across the sand. Corpses of men and horses littered the ground. But the Viking square, those 8 circles of death, remained unbroken. For the first time that day, doubt crept into Abu Nasr's mind. He had seen stubborn enemies before. He had seen men cling to life against impossible odds. But he had never seen anything like this. These were not men fighting for survival. These were men fighting as though they had already died. As if death wasn't their fear, it was their goal. Still, Abu Nasr was no fool. He knew numbers were his greatest weapon, and so he resolved to crush the Norsemen beneath sheer weight.
Charge!
If cavalry and arrows couldn't shatter them, then endless infantry would. The command rang out across the desert. Tens of thousands of infantry surged forward, a living tide of swords, spears, and shields. The earth itself shook under their march. 25 against 1. For any ordinary army, this was the end. But Magnus Barefoot had saved his most devastating weapon for exactly this moment. You see, during their winter in Constantinople, the Vikings had learned more than battlefield tactics. They had acquired a weapon of terror, the Byzantine Greek fire, or at least a version of it. This was no ordinary flame. It clung to armor and skin it fed on wind, and it could not be put out with water. To face it was to face a death you could not escape. And now, as the Saracen infantry closed within striking distance, Magnus gave the signal. Hundreds of incendiary projectiles arced through the air. A heartbeat later, the desert floor erupted into rings of fire around each Viking circle. The flames spread fast, whipped higher by the dry desert winds. Men screamed as the fire latched onto their clothes, their shields, their very skin. Water skins were useless. Sand did nothing. The battlefield became an inferno. Panic tore through the ranks. Soldiers stumbled back, colliding with comrades. Order collapsed. Thousands of men who only moments ago marched with confidence now turned into a stampede of terror. And through that chaos came the Vikings. They didn't wait. They didn't hold. They burst out of their circles, charging straight into the smoke and fire. Imagine the sight: warriors with ash-streaked faces, some already aflame from their own weapons, hacking through terrified men with axes and hooked spears. They screamed ancient Norse prayers as they cut down enemies who outnumbered them by dozens. It was no longer war in any traditional sense. It was primal violence, raw, unrestrained, and fueled by the absolute conviction that death was holy. Abu Nasir watched in horror. His carefully planned annihilation was unraveling. His archers had failed. His cavalry had been slaughtered. His infantry was burning and fleeing. Desperate, he reached for his last card, his personal guard. 2,000 of his finest warriors, battle-hardened veterans, feared across the Middle East. If anyone could salvage victory, it was them. Their mission was clear: kill Magnus, break the leader, and the rest would crumble. The guards charged, banners snapping, steel flashing, and soon the battlefield narrowed to a single focal point: Magnus Barefoot himself. Magnus wasn't just a king, he was a symbol. Towering over 2 meters tall, wielding a massive double-headed axe said to be blessed by the Pope, he was a vision of destruction. Every swing of his weapon sent shockwaves through his men. His mere presence ignited them, driving them into greater frenzy. To the Saracen guard, he looked less like a man and more like a force of nature. What followed was a battle within the battle. The Viking elite and the Saracen guard clashed in a storm of steel. For an hour, the outcome hung in balance. The air was filled with sparks, blood smoke, and screams. The Saracens fought with the desperation of men who knew the entire fate of their army hung on them. The Vikings fought with the certainty that God had already written their victory. At last, the inevitable moment came. Magnus and Abu Nasir faced one another, commander against king, sword against axe. It was a duel that should have been remembered for its balance of skill, but it wasn't. Because from the start, conviction outweighed technique. Abu Nasir was a master swordsman trained in Damascus, a veteran of countless duels. But Magnus was something different, a fusion of raw Viking brutality with European martial training, driven by the belief that every strike carried divine purpose. The duel was short, brutal, final. Magnus's axe struck true, cutting Abu Nasir down. And with that single blow, the battle ended not on the ground, but in the minds of his men. When their commander's body fell, something inside the Saracen army broke. Soldiers who had started the day with pride and confidence now stared in disbelief. Could 800 men truly be unstoppable? Could God really favor these northern demons? The thought spread like wildfire. And with it came total collapse. What followed defied every shred of logic in medieval warfare. 40,000 men transformed into a stampede. Soldiers trampled their own comrades. Officers were ignored or cut down by their own panicked troops. In a single moment, an overwhelming army dissolved into chaos. And Magnus, he didn't let them go. His command was cold, ruthless, no survivors. For the Vikings, this wasn't just a battle anymore. It was holy work. What followed was not a retreat or surrender, but a 3-day hunt. Across the desert, they pursued fleeing soldiers, setting ambushes, cutting off escape routes, cornering groups and executing them. Every death was ritualized with prayers. Every kill was an offering. On the first day, 10,000 Saracens fell. On the second, 15,000 more. By the third day, only scattered survivors remained. In total, more than 35,000 men were slaughtered. When the dust finally settled, of the 800 Vikings who had entered the desert, around 230 had fallen. A staggering loss, yes, but compared to the annihilation of their enemies, it was nothing. Against odds of 40 to 1, the impossible had happened. And yet the true consequences of this massacre stretched far beyond that battlefield. Word of what had happened spread like wildfire across the Muslim world. Damascus trembled. Baghdad whispered. Cairo grew fearful. The idea that a tiny Christian force had annihilated one of the region's largest armies was unthinkable. Suddenly, the Holy Land no longer felt secure. Suddenly, the specter of northern zealots haunted every military plan. Magnus knew the power of reputation, and he wasted no time using it. He rallied local Christian allies who had lived under Muslim rule for generations. Within weeks, his force swelled from 800 survivors to more than 3,000 men. Not just soldiers, but zealots. Men who believed God himself had handed them a destiny. And as they marched, something strange happened. Cities began to surrender before a fight even began. Rumors spread that angels fought beside the Norsemen, that their armor was invincible, that no weapon could touch them. Whether true or not didn't matter. Fear itself became Magnus's deadliest weapon. This was no longer a campaign of conquest. It was a campaign of terror. And every victory, no matter how small, was magnified into legend. But as terrifying as this was, the full weight of the massacre's consequences would not be felt until decades later. When the Crusades swept across Europe, the massacre at Herodium didn't just echo in the sands of the Holy Land. Its shockwaves rippled across continents, reshaping the way both Christians and Muslims thought about war, faith, and fear itself. Magnus Barefoot and his surviving warriors had become living legends, and legends, as history shows us, are often more powerful than armies. As their numbers grew swelled by local Christians desperate for liberation, the Vikings' campaign shifted. They weren't interested in slow sieges or negotiations. They used speed, terror, and reputation as their greatest weapons. A single banner of the Norsemen on the horizon could cause entire towns to open their gates without a fight. Chroniclers describe villages where peasants fled at the mere rumor that the northern fanatics were approaching. And when Magnus's men entered a city, it wasn't with measured governance. It was with ritual. Every enemy executed was framed as divine justice. Every victory was sanctified with prayer. The survivors of the massacre of Jerusalem fought not as ordinary soldiers, but as zealots convinced that God had marked them for destiny. Within weeks, the force that had been just 800 grew to 3,000. And within months, their reputation had transformed into something far greater a myth. Rumors traveled faster than armies. Stories whispered in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad told of warriors who could not be killed, of men who burst into flames without dying, of angels who shielded the Norsemen from arrows. Whether anyone truly believed these tales didn't matter. What mattered was that commanders hesitated, soldiers doubted, and fear spread like wildfire. For Magnus, this fear was a gift. He wielded it as carefully as his axe. He understood that the psychology of war could achieve what brute force could not. And so instead of seeking massive battles, he cultivated terror. Skirmishes were exaggerated into epics. Minor raids became legends of divine conquest. By the time word reached Europe, the story had grown beyond recognition. And this was the moment history turned. Back in Europe, Pope Urban II was preparing his monumental call for the First Crusade. The church needed proof that God favored Christian arms, proof that victory in the Holy Land was possible. And suddenly here was the perfect tale, 800 Norse warriors annihilating 40,000 Saracens. A story so impossible, so drenched in divine imagery, that it could inspire thousands to take the cross. Chroniclers went to work. They added flourishes. They claimed angels had fought beside the Vikings, that their weapons had been kissed by miracles, that their armor was consecrated and invulnerable. Whether anyone believed every word didn't matter, the psychological effect was everything. Across Europe, nobles and knights heard the tale and drew one conclusion: if God had granted victory to 800 men. Imagine what tens of thousands of crusaders could achieve. Suddenly, what had once seemed like a distant dream, the reconquest of Jerusalem, felt inevitable. The story of Magnus Barefoot and his warriors became a rallying cry. It was told in churches, whispered in taverns, and sung in ballads. And as men gathered under the banners of Christendom, they carried that story with them. The massacre at Jerusalem had become more than history. It had become propaganda. But legend always carries a darker edge. Because Magnus's campaign didn't just inspire hope, it set a precedent. It justified brutality. The Vikings had slaughtered tens of thousands and declared it holy work. And in doing so, they gave future crusaders permission to do the same. If holy war was truly God's will, then no act of violence was too extreme, no massacre too great, no atrocity too dark. The methods the Vikings pioneered: incendiary weapons, ritual executions, relentless pursuit would be repeated for centuries. From the burning of towns in the Levant to the ruthless campaigns of the Teutonic Knights in Eastern Europe, echoes of Magnus's warriors could be heard again and again. Magnus himself, though, would never see the long shadow of his actions. Just 5 years later, in 1069, he was cut down in battle near Antioch. But even in death, his legend only grew. Epic songs were sung of his deeds. Churches were dedicated in his honor. His name was invoked by warriors who sought courage in desperate battles, as though calling on him could summon divine favor. To the north, the few survivors who returned to Scandinavia were celebrated as heroes. Their tales lit fires in the hearts of young men who would later march east under the banner of Christ. And thus the model was born: small, elite bands of religious fanatics defeating armies many times their size. The template spread like wildfire. Orders like the Templars and the Hospitallers carried forward the same blend of faith and ferocity. The Crusades themselves became an experiment in mass-producing the fanaticism Magnus had harnessed in his 800 warriors. But here's the most haunting part: the massacre at Jerusalem proved something far bigger than one battle. It proved that numbers weren't everything, that morale, belief, and psychological dominance could outweigh sheer size. A small, unified, fanatically dedicated force could topple a giant army if it shattered their spirit. And that idea didn't just stay in the Middle Ages. It echoes through military history again and again. Guerrilla wars, revolutions, resistance movements. The notion that conviction can outweigh numbers was written in blood on the sands of Jerusalem in 1064. But if belief is more powerful than numbers, then the question becomes, what happens when belief serves not good? But evil Magnus's men were convinced they were God's instruments. To their enemies, they were demons unleashed. Both views contained truth. Their conviction made them extraordinary. Their brutality made them monstrous. And so we're left with a paradox. Was their devotion admirable or horrifying? Did their faith elevate them or damn them? What can't be denied is this: their actions change history. The legend of Magnus Barefoot and his 800 warriors didn't fade with time. In fact, it grew with every telling, carried by chroniclers, priests, and soldiers.
And from these valiant
And like all
deeds,
legends, it became less about the details and more about the message. For Christians in Europe, the massacre at Jerusalem was proof that God himself favored their cause. For Muslims in the Middle East, it was a warning, a shadow that haunted commanders for generations. In Europe, the tale was irresistible. The timing was perfect. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade decades later, the story of Magnus's impossible victory was held up as the ultimate example of divine intervention. If 800 men could destroy an army of 40,000, then surely tens of thousands of crusaders marching together could not fail. The massacre became legend, and legend became propaganda. Songs claimed angels had fought beside the Norsemen. Chroniclers insisted their weapons were touched by miracles. Some even wrote that the desert winds themselves carried the screams of their enemies to terrify unbelievers. Whether people believed every detail was irrelevant. What mattered was the fire it lit. Thousands of men took up the cross, convinced that victory was inevitable. But the cost was darker than most realized. The Vikings had slaughtered without mercy and justified it as divine work. And in doing so, they carved out a precedent in holy war. Anything was permissible. Brutality wasn't just allowed, it was sanctified. Future crusaders would imitate this model. The use of fire as terror, the ritual of executions, the pursuit of fleeing enemies, these methods spread across Christendom. When armies sacked cities like Jerusalem in 1099 or Constantinople in 1204, they weren't just fighting wars. They were enacting rituals of annihilation modeled on Magnus's example. Magnus himself never saw how far his influence reached. In 1069, only a few years after his desert massacre, he was cut down in battle near Antioch, fighting Turkish forces. By all accounts, he died as he had lived axe in hand, refusing to retreat, convinced that every strike carried divine weight. But death did not end his power, it transformed him. To the north in Norway and beyond, Magnus became more than a king, he became a myth. Epic songs were sung of his deeds. Churches were built in his honor. His name was invoked on battlefields for courage, as though his spirit could be summoned like a saint of war. The few Vikings who returned from Jerusalem were celebrated as heroes. Their stories lit fires in the hearts of young warriors, many of whom would later march east themselves. Joining the great waves of the Crusades, the massacre revealed something bigger than the fate of one battle. Numbers don't decide everything. Faith, morale, and psychological dominance often outweigh raw size. A small group of fanatics can topple a giant if they shatter the enemy's spirit. That's why commanders across Europe tried to replicate the Viking model elite, faith-driven units designed to fight with unshakable conviction. Some succeeded spectacularly, others failed, but the lesson-endured belief could be more dangerous than the sword itself. Propaganda became a weapon as sharp as any blade. Once Magnus's men had earned their reputation for invincibility, that reputation fought battles for them. Armies surrendered before lifting a weapon. Allies rallied eagerly. Fear alone won campaigns. From today's perspective, the massacre of Jerusalem is both awe-inspiring and horrifying. On one hand, it shows the extremes of human endurance and courage when driven by conviction. On the other, it exposes the abyss of cruelty that same conviction can justify. The Vikings' faith made them unstoppable, but it also made them merciless. Their belief allowed them to endure unbearable wounds, heat, and fatigue, but it also allowed them to slaughter tens of thousands without hesitation, convinced it was holy work. That duality is what makes the story so haunting. Was their devotion admirable or horrifying? Did their faith elevate them or damn them? The truth is, it was both. For the Muslim world, the memory of northern fanatics who had turned the desert into an inferno lingered for generations. Even as armies rebuilt, the legend lingered. Commanders knew that morale could collapse faster than walls. That terror could undo even the largest forces. The massacre had become more than an event, it was a scar. And yet the story of Magnus and his warriors carries a lesson that still resonates today. The limits of human possibility are not always physical, but mental. The impossible often exists only in the mind. The Vikings didn't walk away from impossible odds. They faced them and turned them into reality. That's the inspiration. But here's the warning: the same fanaticism that allowed them to achieve the impossible also unleashed atrocity. Conviction is power, but that power can serve creation or destruction. The massacre of Jerusalem stands as one of history's most extreme examples of what a small group of dedicated people can achieve. It fascinates us because it shows the best and worst of human nature. Side by side, courage and loyalty, but also cruelty and destruction. Magnus Barefoot and his 800 warriors remind us that belief can move more than mountains. It can move armies, it can alter history. A handful of men united by conviction shape the destiny of nations. Their actions remind us of both the danger and the power of faith. Because in the end, the question is not whether conviction can change the world. It's what cause that conviction serves. That is the true legacy of the Vikings in Jerusalem, both a warning and an inspiration.